Hello. We're missing a couple of lectures in History 220, and I wanted to do a short mini lecture on fascism, National Socialism, and the Second World War to bridge our material from this week, week 10, and next week, week 11. In the wake of the Great War, the United States and the Soviet Union seemed to offer competing political and economic models to European countries struggling to rebuild. They were rebuilding their states, their economies, and their societies after the war. In the simplest terms, the US model was liberal capitalist democracy, and the Soviet model was authoritarian state-directed socialism. And both these models were very attractive after 1918. But there was a rapidly growing sentiment in favor of alternatives in the 1920s and 1930s. Disenchanted with both the class conflict of liberal democracy and the class struggle of communism, in the 1920s, fascists claimed to offer a third way, a socialist nationalism. Fascism spawned a series of right-wing, nationalist, authoritarian political movements that seized power in Italy and Germany and had substantial influence elsewhere, in particular in the 1930s. Fascists stressed national community over conflict and orderly authoritarian rule over the messiness of democracy. It's no surprise that fascist movements were particularly popular at times of economic and political stress. So large numbers of Italians embraced Mussolini's fascist party in 1922, seeing it as a vigorous response to Italy's economic and political chaos after the war. And Hitler's National Socialist, or Nazi Party, rocketed from near obscurity in 1928 to electoral success in 1930, when Germany was in the depths of economic depression. So, what did fascism look like? I'm going to describe 8 distinguishing features of fascist movements. First, the primacy of instinct over reason. So action based on instinct was a sign of strength, and excess reflection and intellectualizing was seen as weak. This was often an explicit rejection of Enlightenment rationalism and also individualism. Second of all, glorification of the state. Fascists believed that the state was the embodiment of the spirit of the people, and individuals served the state and not vice versa. In theory, the state should be totalitarian, meaning that it would control every aspect of public life and even much of private life. Third, the leader principle. Because fascists favored a single unified nation and a strong state, they embraced the leader principle, a strong, singular leader who would rule and take action decisively in the interests of the nation. And fascists believed that certain men were made to be leaders and that they would drift to the top in a kind of social Darwinian natural selection. And actually, number 4, social Darwinism. This really extended to all aspects of fascist ideology. Most fascists believed that their nation or race was superior to other nations and that they must prove themselves through competition with other races. Many fascists were obsessed with racial health and purity, believing that impurities could weaken their nation in struggles with their neighbors. So it's not surprising that a lot of fascists supported eugenics, and as we'll see next week, in week 11, that the fascist negative eugenics program was really quite ominous. Eugenicists and many fascists wanted to use a kind of selective breeding to eliminate the unfit from the gene pool, while encouraging the supposedly fit to reproduce. And the unfit, in their view, included anything from the mentally handicapped to homosexuals to Jews and other minorities. And many, but not all, fascist movements were anti-Semitic, attacking Jews for their reputed internationalism, liberalism, and capitalist selfishness, or alternately, socialist materialism. So, ironically, Jews were associated both with capitalism and with communism. Number 5 was the cult of force. This was an extension of social Darwinist thinking. The struggle among nations required force, war, and expansionism in the fascist point of view. Those who sat still would lose the battle and be left behind by history. Drawing on a romanticized version of the front experience in World War I, fascists considered war glorious and a test of manhood. Most fascists didn't think much of culture. They considered power and force to be the highest form of beauty. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, once said, "When I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun." And for a fascist, marching soldiers were the closest thing to the sublime, the most beautiful. And this combined with their love of youth, war, action, movement, and unity. And you get a very good sense of this aesthetic from the Junger piece that we are reading for this week, or week 10. Fascists were masters of propaganda and pageantry, number 6. They used public rallies and marches to build a sense of unity. They were among the first to realize the power of the radio and television to indoctrinate people. So Hitler's hypnotizing speeches filled the airwaves, and he employed the best filmmakers in Germany to make propaganda films, including The Triumph of the Will, bits of which we'll watch next week. Number 7, in terms of actual policy, fascists were best defined by what they were against: Bolshevism and liberalism. They rejected liberal capitalism as selfish and spiritually bankrupt. Individualism, in their view, only led to disunity and thus the weakness of the nation and state. But they also rejected the Marxist idea of class struggle, since that too undermined unity of the nation. The fascist third way required unity of all classes and individuals for the good of the whole nation. And then finally, number 8, many fascists, including Hitler and Mussolini, advanced an economic theory known as corporatism. This was based on the guild system of the old regime. You'll remember us talking about corporatism when we talked about the old regime in the 18th century. The idea was that factory owners and workers in a given industry would come together in joint councils to determine their production goals, so they wouldn't be in conflict with each other. Though no fascist regime actually implemented a fully corporatist system, they pressed corporatist imagery in their propaganda. Instead of identifying by class, fascists urged workers and managers to think of themselves in terms of the economic sector they worked in, and to work together for the good of the nation. So our textbook has quite a bit on Mussolini in Italy and Hitler's National Socialism in Germany. I want to focus in a little bit on the Nazi regime, as it gives us a sense of what fascism was and was not once it actually held power. As you know from the textbook, the Great Depression made Hitler's Nazi Party the most popular in Germany in 1932 elections. And these elections sparked the final crisis of the Weimar Republic. Extreme parties, the Nazis and the Communists, together won the majority of seats in parliament. So ironically, these democratic elections had led to the victory of anti-democratic parties. It was clear that the majority of Germans, like so many other Europeans during the Great Depression, the majority had lost faith in democracy. A group of conservatives in Germany thought the time was right to abandon democracy in favor of an authoritarian government. They believed they could use Hitler's popular support by incorporating him into a white right-wing authoritarian regime. So in early 1933, the aging president, the former general von Hindenburg, appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany. Chancellors like the Prime Minister. Hindenburg and other conservatives thought they could control Hitler and that power would moderate him. But Hitler quickly disappointed them and marginalized the conservatives, and he got the Reichstag, the parliament of Germany, to grant him emergency dictatorial powers. So, what was life like under Hitler? Many Germans, remembering that period after he came to power, from 1933 to 1938, they recalled it as a period of normalcy, or rather a return to normality after the crisis years and the depression of the Weimar Republic. By rebuilding Germany's military, and by building the massive German highway system known as the Autobahn, Hitler nearly ended unemployment by 1936. Contrary to early promises, Hitler did little to change the capitalist system. And in fact, the Nazis developed close ties to industry leaders. And though Hitler did arrest leading communists and banned opposition parties in 1933, the Nazi terror, as it was sometimes called, it actually only touched a small part of society, namely communists, some social democrats, and Jews at first. And for the vast majority of Germans, the persecution of the Jews was easy to shrug off. Even though Jews had been widely assimilated and spoke German and were very much part of the German economy, there was still a widespread anti-Semitism in Germany, or at least a sense that Jews were not real 100% Germans. The Nazi secret police, the Gestapo, did play a role in rooting out and arresting opposition in the 30s. But overall, its presence in German society was not that noticeable to most people before the war. And it wasn't really needed, as it turned out. The Nazis would make laws, and Germans tended to follow them. So when Hitler put anti-Jewish laws into effect in 1934 and 1935, police were hardly needed to carry them out. The citizens simply helped enforce the laws and reported people who seemed to be violating them. Universities, schools, and government agencies simply fired Jews, and local residents reported to police when Jews violated marriage laws. In general, the Nazi system of oppression depended more on denunciation, turning your neighbors in, and voluntary compliance than it did on the secret police. So again, an appearance of normality reigned, but it was normality only for some, with a broad portion of society complicit in the oppression of selected groups like Jews, people with disabilities, and communists, among others. I want to conclude with a quick introduction to the Second World War. With rearmament and a series of foreign policy successes in the mid-1930s, Germans had a sense of momentum. The feeling of helplessness that followed the Versailles Treaty dissolved. Hitler, in announcing the rebirth of the German Empire, he called it the Third Reich, Hitler claimed a continuity with the glory years of German economic growth and imperial expansion under Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm. The problem was that momentum and expansion became self-perpetuating. It became something that everyone expected. Hitler and the Nazi leaders believed that a slowdown would disappoint the German people and could lead to unrest. So, unlike the Soviet dictator Stalin, who spent the 1930s retrenching and building socialism in one country, as he put it, Hitler's Nazi machine had to keep expanding, reaching out for new successes. It was this momentum to expand that led Hitler to his first forays beyond the borders of Germany. In March 1938, Hitler used a political dispute as an excuse to annex Austria. And in September 1938, Hitler convinced Britain and France to allow him to annex the Sudetenland, a largely German region on the border of Czechoslovakia. And by the way, my own research has to do with that border region in Czechoslovakia from the 1930s to the 1990s. In August of 1939, Hitler and Stalin surprised the world by agreeing to a non-aggression pact. A secret clause of the treaty included the division of Poland into Nazi and Soviet spheres. On September 1, 1939, Germany staged a provocation on the border of Poland and then invaded. And the Soviet Union occupied eastern Poland. Realizing that Hitler's expansionism would not end without resistance, England and France declared war on Germany. I want to end with a few words about the two fronts. Like in World War I, war and occupation on the Western and Eastern fronts were drastically different. Germany defeated France quickly this time and dealt relatively mildly with the defeated French, setting up a French puppet regime in the southern half of France. The Germans treated French and British prisoners of war with respect, granting them the rights guaranteed by international law. But on the Eastern Front, and in occupied territories in Poland, Russia, and Yugoslavia, the Germans behaved atrociously, executing millions of POWs and civilians, including close to 6 million Jews, 3 million Poles, and millions more of other groups. Over the course of the war, Germany shipped over 7 million people from the east to Germany or occupied Poland for forced labor. Along with the Soviets, they systematically murdered much of the Polish elite, including pre-war politicians, university professors, religious leaders, and others. The differences between the fronts had to do with Nazi racial ideology and a common German attitude that Jews and Slavs were not real human beings, but instead were so-called Untermenschen, or people who were lesser than others. Well, we'll come back to Nazi racial policy, ethnic cleansing, and the Holocaust in lecture on Monday. Thank you for your attention.